All right, so I'm here with Greg Lapine, and Greg, you were a JI case, Tenneco JI case, Case IH dealer, and then finally a CNH Case IH dealer, right?
Correct.
All right, so Greg, this is obviously December 1993, so the 7200 series was coming out. So this
Right.
was
Yep.
to talk about 7100 series.
Yep.
How many 7100 series do you think total you sold?
Of the Magnums total, we did over 400, but probably 50 of them were the MXs. But of the good Magnums, the old ones, there was probably 150 of the 71s. The 7200s and 8900s was where we really grew with the Magnums.
Yep.
The 7100s are kind of the blazer of the trail, but those guys were all trading the 72s and 89s, and then that market grew because they had such a good reputation.
Yeah. And then, so 94, that was the 7200 series.
Yep.
So what was 7220 or 7230 the most common?
I would say the 20.
Okay, dual
because
PTO.
They had dual PTO.
Yep.
Yep. And the farm size was there. Then, believe it or not, I would say our next big seller was the 50. Because
Okay.
the guys wanted them to chop.
Yep.
They wanted that horsepower.
Now, if you had a customer say, though, I want a 7240, but I want dual PTO, would you find like a 5088 to pull a dual speed?
We would take one right out of a Magnum. You could order that whole
Okay.
assembly.
Yep.
So you take it out of a 20 and put it into a 30 or a 40 or a 50.
Okay. So then that 1985, so that's the first year of Case IH then, right?
Yep.
And then top territory sales. How big was the territory?
Our territory was about probably a third of Wisconsin and a third of Minnesota was what our territory rep covered.
Okay.
Now, we were out of what was called the Minneapolis branch.
Yep.
That covered Wisconsin, Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Montana, and part of Wyoming.
Okay.
So the Minneapolis branch was geographically a pretty good sized branch.
And so you guys were probably one of the top Magnum dealers in that period.
Yeah.
And then 88, so Magnum's introduced in what, was it Farm Progress in 87 when it was introduced or something?
Whenever it was here in Dunn County is when they were entered. It would have been 99.
Well, so 1988, when the boxcar Magnums came out, they were technically started in 87, but you weren't really selling them probably until 88, right? You were still trying to sell the leftovers.
Well, I hate to put it this way, but we were in Denver, my wife and I, when they introduced the Magnums. In Case always would introduce whether it was the Case IH merge.
Yep.
That was introduced in Las Vegas because it was a big gamble.
Yep.
When they introduced the Magnums, they did it in Denver because that was the mile-high city, and the Magnums were going to be a mile high of the competition.
Okay.
So there was always a theme to when they did this. But yeah, they introduced them in Denver, and they introduced the program to clean out the 94 series.
And yep.
And I went to my territory. First, I come out of that meeting, I went right to the phone and called my dad, and I said, start transferring in anything you can get your hands on. Doesn't matter, just grab them. I said, any dealer that's got one or two aren't going to be able to compete. Just grab anything. And he said, you realize you got a whole yard full now? I said, yeah, just grab whatever you can grab. Then I found a territory rep and I said, who come up with this program? Why? I said, you're going to be out of tractors in 30 days. Oh, no. He said, that's going to take 6 months at least. I said, no, you're going to be out in 30 days, I'm telling you. Because it was a graduated scale. The first one you got like 10% off. The second one was 20, the third one was 30, the fourth one was 40. The fifth one and on was 50% off.
I remember hearing that. There was 50%.
I mean, I tell people I sold 38 new tractors in 28 days, but I didn't really sell them. I gave them away. I mean, I went out to customers and priced them, and it was like sticker shock. Nobody was taking me up, and the marketing guy in Minneapolis called me and he said, "You gonna get them all sold?" I said, "Oh yeah." He said, "Don't let me down." I said, "I won't." Well, then it was probably 2-3 weeks before these guys started coming in. And I have a very good friend, very good customer. I asked him years later, I said, "How come you didn't take me up on that right away?" And he said it wasn't a question if I was going to. It was a question of how many I was going to get. So, Bill Creaser was the same way. He said, I was just deciding how many I was going to take.
Yeah.
So, but then they introduced the Magnum, and they had all kinds of supply issues, and there was a gap there that we had nothing to sell because the 94s were gone literally in that 30 days, like I said.
Yep.
And the Magnums weren't coming off the line. Jerry Green, who was the president of Case IH at the time, lost his job over it because dealers were lighting up the phone, and the people at the factory weren't telling Jerry what was going on. "Oh yeah, we got it handled, they're coming off the line." Well, Jim Kettleson, who had been the head of Case, became the head of Tenneco. He got on the corporate jet and flew to Racine and went right to the tractor plant and went from there to Jerry Green's office and said, "You're done." And we went from the fall of '87 till the spring of '88 before the Magnum started coming out in any numbers.
Okay.
So there was a vacuum there.
That's what I was thinking. An '87 Magnum is pretty rare.
Yeah, yeah.
Most of them were, yeah.
We sold 2 of the first 100 Magnums because the Territory rep come around and they had a wooden box.
Yep.
And it had a bottle of champagne in it. There was a bottle called a Magnum. I'm not a drinker, but supposedly that's what it was. And we took that out to 2 customers that were the 2 that were of the first 100 that bought Magnums.
And they got champagne for
Right.
That's pretty cool.
In a wooden box that said Magnum on it, and they were. One of them went south of here. The other one went to Van Dyke, sitting in Richmond.
Oh,
Those were the 2 first ones that we sold.
Okay.
And then yeah, they took off after that.
Oh yeah. The Magnums were. So this is one of your customers that had a lot of Magnums over the years, right?
Right.
Which, yeah, that's a lot of tractors. So, and we should point out, you had one store. You weren't a multi-dealer location. Right. You sold 350 Magnums out
of one store.
Yeah.
And when we started, our shop was 50 by 60.
Right.
And then when we moved out along the interstate, I originally was going to make the shop 70 by 100. And my dad said, that's not even close. He said, go to 200. And I said, I got to pay for it. He said, I'm telling you, 100's not going to do it. And so I did increase it. We went 70 by 150.
Yep.
And it was too small.
Yep.
And that, my wife's dad was a Butler building dealer, so we were a little bit ingrained to Butler buildings.
Yep.
And that was fun, refereeing between her dad and my dad, but we got it.
Yep. And multi-generation. Your dad started, right?
My dad started in 1956 as a Case dealer. Had room for 1 tractor and 1 row of parts bins, and then he grew from there to a bigger building. And then in '72, he built a bigger addition to it. And then in '85, when Case IH, Case was owned by Tenneco. In '85, when Case and IH got put together, we become Case IH.
Yep. So you guys kind of had your old dealership downtown was kind of like you had multiple lots because it was kind of spread out, right?
My mom and dad lived across the street, and there was a half a city block next to their house that was full of stuff. And then in front of our building, there was stuff. And then behind the Super America store, we had rented that. That was full of stuff. And then You went down that block a little further, and there was an elderly lady down there that we rented part of her yard. So we had stuff. Yeah, I knew this wasn't going to last long in town because we'd have semis lined up on Highway 12 waiting to get in to get unloaded.
Yep.
And I thought, this is just, sooner or later, the city's going to say, out.
Yeah.
So when we put our deal together out on the interstate, that gave us 10 acres of room.
That was there was an old brick. One of the buildings was brick, wasn't it, or something? Or
No, our yeah, you're right. The original building that he built a couple of years after he started was cement block.
yeah, yep.
And then we built a steel building for shop and turned the original shop into parts and offices.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I remember going there, and I think you guys probably still had the case sign up.
Probably.
Yeah.
It
didn't look anything like what you picture for a implement dealer today.
Right.
But yeah, your dad was kind of known to be quite a salesman. But do you remember? So Tenneco bought Case, so the relationship with Case goes back further than Tenneco. So 60.
I could give you a little bit of history on the whole Case thing. When a guy by the name of Mark Reutemann became president of Case, they introduced the Case-O-Matic.
Yep.
And that was in the early 60s.
Yep.
And, my dad took hold of that, and he demonstrated them things all over. Guys, a lot of people, the Case-O-Matic is a love-hate relationship. You either loved it or you hated it.
Yep.
But he demonstrated them, and he taught people how to drive them, and the guys that had them loved them.
Mm-hmm.
So, but, we had like 20 800s sitting there, and they were all running to the end of their floor plan terms. And my mom told him, you better get something done. So he went to Minneapolis, talked to the branch manager, and come home. She said, what'd you do? And he said, I ordered 20 more. And she said, are you crazy? He said, well, you give us new terms on the ones we got. And then they come out with a big program, and we got an award for that. He was the top tractor dealer out of Minneapolis because he told me one day, he said it was either sell them or go out of business.
Yep.
And so he sold 800s all over the place. But that, Reitman put them in the tractor business, but he also about broke them. They were about broke. And James Kettleson was one of the accountants at Case.
Yep.
And he put together a deal with, I think it was 500 banks to keep Case afloat. He went on to become the president of Case. And in about 67, Tenneco bought what was called Kern County land, which was in California. And they owned a whole bunch of Case's stock. And so when Tenneco bought Kern County, they started looking at all the businesses that Kern County had, and they said, this farm equipment thing, we don't need that, sell it. And they got so many offers to buy Case that they said, wait a minute, we better take another look at this. And so Tenneco decided to keep Case and poured a lot of money into it. And that the late 60s is when the 70 series were R&D'd. Case bought Drott. They bought Davis, Universal skid steers, which became the Case skid steer. Yep. But they gave Case the money to build a new research and development facility. They just said, here, whatever we got to do to make this business. And, through the 70s and the 80s, Case did very well.
Which, that's one thing I want to ask. So at some point in there, Case went away from being a full line.
Correct. 1972 was the last of the planters, balers, windrowers, combines. They decided to just concentrate on tractors, and that's what we did. We didn't pick up New Holland or New Idea or Heston or anything else. We just thought, well, let's just concentrate. And at the time, we also had what's called a utility contract, so we could sell backhoes and forklifts and small end loaders and crawlers, and that kind of filled in from the losing the combines and balers and windrowers, because the balers and windrowers were a big chunk of our business.
Yeah, this was dairy country.
Right.
Well, so they kept tillage equipment though, didn't they?
They did, but they bought it all.
Okay.
The plows were made by White.
Yep.
The discs were either, depending on which series, was either Hutchmaster or Amco.
Yep.
And the field cultivators were Glencoe.
Okay.
So they had the tillage, but it was all made by somebody else. The loaders were made by Great Bend.
Okay.
But they had the case, colors, and name on them.
Did you guys keep the construction contract all the way through?
We kept it till about, we were still downtown, but I could see that we weren't going to be able to keep up with both. The ag thing was growing like a rocket. And it's two different customer bases.
They're very different.
Yeah, and this might offend some people, but if you drive into a farmer's place in a Lincoln Continental, I'm not buying nothing because he's making way too much money. If you drive into a contractor's place in a Chevy, you're not successful. Get out of here.
Yep.
It's just, there's two different bases, two different needs, two different wants. And we'd kind of been a thorn in the side of the construction dealer in Eau Claire. And contractual wise, we kept adding to our contract because our contract originally was Dunn County. But as dealers went out, when we ended up, we had our ag contract was Dunn County, Pepin County, part of Chippewa, part of Eau Claire, all of Pierce, all of St. Croix. But the ag thing I kind of fell asleep on and woke up one day and found out all we had was Dunn County.
What do you mean the construction?
For the construction.
Yeah.
And what they did I didn't like, but it's just the wave of the future. They come out with a deal that if you sold something outside of your area of responsibility, they charged you 5% of the invoice and credited the dealer that you sold into their area on the construction side.
Oh.
And so we're sitting here with Dunn County, and we did sell a lot of loader backhoes. But I called the dealer in Eau Claire, and I said, I can be a thorn in the side or I can be gone forever. And he said, I'll be right over. So that's how we got out of the construction side and just concentrated on the ag.
Were you able to keep skid loaders, though,
Yes,
with ag?
Skid loaders was a separate contract.
Okay, because dairy country, I mean,
Oh, yeah.
1845 uniloaders, I mean, how many do you think you sold of those?
A pile.
Yeah.
And they were bulletproof.
Yeah, absolutely.
1840s was, actually 1840 was probably a bigger seller than the 45 because they were narrower and they'd fit in a lot of places.
Yep.
When there were a lot of hogs around here, we sold a lot of what was called 1816. They had a 16 horse.
Had one as a kid.
We sold them literally by the semi-load. You'd put them on crossways.
Yeah.
And, every hog farmer had one.
Yep. Little owning in them.
Yep.
And
The early ones had a Tecumseh, and the later ones had the Onan.
Yep.
And we sold a lot of skid steers.
Yeah. Oh, that's dairy country. That was
Right.
So then 70 series comes out. I'm assuming you sold some golden demos and some black knights, right?
We had, the first ones were golden demos.
Yep. Because it was a screw up, wasn't it? They didn't get the memo to paint the cab or something, right?
And then the last 2 years they were black knights and they were all black. And
Yep.
a dealer could order one, and you could order whatever you wanted, 770 through 1470, and equip it any way you wanted. 8-speed, power shift, cab, no cab, But the majority of them, like here, pretty much they were all 1070 cab power shifts.
Yep.
And, that was my job all spring, was to run around demonstrating them. You just drive up and down the road and pull in and show them how to run it and leave it for a day and go back, pick it up, and take it to the next place. And
Yep.
we sold a lot of them because when it got at the end of the year, it was time to sell them. A lot of customers said, I don't want that thing. Everybody in the counties drove that thing. I don't want that.
Yeah.
So they did have a big program, and my dad transferred a lot of them in because they had a good deal on them. So we sold a lot of Black Knights around here.
And dairy farmers are like, I like cheap.
Right, right. The other thing my dad did that I would like to find, it was in a Case magazine, and I need to find it. In 1970, he went to the county fair with machinery displays, and he took a brand new 1070 and tipped it over. He went to the highway commissioner and said, hey, how much you going to charge me to come with the crane and pick a tractor up and tip it over? And he said, why are you going to do that? He said, because it's a roll-proof cab. I'm going to show people. He said, I won't charge you anything. So we did it early in the morning in case it crushed.
Yep.
But that word had leaked out, and John Deere was there with a movie camera filming the whole thing. And we picked it up and tried to tip it over, and it didn't want to tip, so we went and got another tractor and pulled it over. And there it sat in our display on its top. We put a snow fence around it, and there was a lot of rumors about it was shipped in here by Case. It's styrofoam. There's any gears in it. You know, there's all kinds of stuff. But the funny part of it, he called Minneapolis, the branch, and said, hey, I got a 1070 tipped over. And they said, well, if it's financed, it's covered in insurance. He said, no, I tipped it over myself. They said, what? So he told them what he did, and they said, we'll be right down. So there's two guys come down, took a bunch of pictures, and put it in one of their magazines. And that fall, they called, and they said, hey, you still got that 1070 sitting there? Yeah. They said, bring it up to Minnesota State Fair and show us how to do this. We're going to do it up here. So we did. And then we took it to a Farm Progress show and did it. And then we sold it to a customer over here about 3 miles. And that thing had been tipped over 3 times. But he knew it. I mean, we told him. And then Case actually took one and mounted it on a trailer and took it around to all the farm shows.
Huh.
So he was a marketer. I'll give him that.
Yeah.
You know. But yeah, we sold a lot of 9 and 1070s, and then when the 13s and 15s come out, we sold a lot of 15s because they wanted the power for chopping.
Did you sell any Spirit of 76s?
We did not. I've wondered that. You know, I mean, all you had to do was order one.
Yep.
You know, I mean, it wasn't that they were limited, or I don't remember how many they built, but we didn't. I don't know why we didn't sell one. Just a lot of Black Knights, but we never had a Spirit, and I don't know why.
Okay. There were a fair amount of 2470s around, too, weren't there?
Yeah.
Because dairy farmers would buy a 2470 because they were rigid frame and had PTO.
Right. If you were going to try and chop with a 4-wheel drive, that was what you wanted because you didn't have the articulation.
Right.
You know. But yeah, we sold a lot of 24s. I didn't sell any 26s because, you know, I'm a guy that if I believe in it, I'm going to push it pretty hard, and I want my customers to feel comfortable that what I'm telling them is right.
Yep.
And the 2670, they were pushing the 504 motor just beyond its capabilities. They had trouble with them heating up and block and head problems, and they were just pushing it too far.
Yep.
So if my customers, if you wanted more horsepower, I'll sell you a 2870. You know, then you got motor enough to put out the power.
How many cubes was the 2870?
674.
Okay.
And that was a Scania motor.
Was that a V8 in that?
No.
Okay.
Straight 6.
Okay.
Yep.
And that had the newer, the 2870 had the newer style hood like the 90 series, right? Or,
Yeah, 2870, the hood tipped up.
Yep.
Like the 90 series.
Yep.
Yeah. Yep.
So then you get into the 90 series, and I'm guessing, because what year did they, 78?
They introduced them in 78.
Okay.
Yep.
So you probably sold quite a few, I'm guessing, 2290s?
22s and 25s. You know,
Okay.
Very few for whatever reason. We sold some, but we didn't sell a lot of 20s. They were just a little bit small.
Yep.
A lot of 22s, some 23s, but a lot of 25s. Same thing. Everybody wanted the power for chopping.
If I remember right, I think growing up, I grew up down on County Road D, east of Ellsworth, southeast of Ellsworth. Gary Bauer was my neighbor.
Yeah.
Gary,
He bought a 2390 from me.
right?
Yep.
Still has it.
Does he?
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. He's Gary has a lot of cases. He is diehard.
That was, I mean, about the time he bought that, that was kind of at the height of the farm crash.
Yeah.
You know, it was tough selling anything, let alone a brand new one. And I remember he pulled up in front of the building downtown and come in and said, I want to buy that tractor. I about fell out of my chair. You know, I mean, you ride the road all day long knocking on doors, and this guy just pulls up and says, I want to buy that tractor.
Yeah, because that was like, it was like 82 or 83 when he bought that, right?
Yeah.
Like it was.
Yeah.
Cause
Yeah, I remember, like I said, I remember him pulling up and coming in and buying it.
Yeah. Well, and growing up, Gary, so, we were mostly dairy around us down by Ellsworth, but there's some pretty good land and we're close to the river. So there were a handful of crop farmers. And I'd drive by Gary's, he had like a 10 or 12,000 bushel Chicago bin, and a Super B dryer and had that 2390. And you're like, man, that guy's really farming,
Right.
And he still has it. He's got a pile of cases. He thinks Magnums are probably too complicated. So.
I would agree when you go to the MXs, the old, what I call the good Magnums. They're not complicated. I mean, all of them that we sold, about the only thing we ever had to do is there's 2 nitrogen charged accumulators that will lose some charge and then they'll shift a little funky. They'll hesitate, and we used to keep 2 of them charged, and people bring theirs in and we'd send them home with the ones that were charged and we'd recharge them. And that was really the only thing we ever had with Magnums. I mean, they were just bulletproof.
So back to the farm crisis, it really started to hit 81, 82, right? Like 80 was probably still all right. I mean, you're selling equipment.
Yep.
And dairy farmers were doing okay, I think. But how bad did your sales drop off?
I don't know if I can really give you a percentage, but I mean, it dropped significantly. I mean, people were depressed. They didn't want to talk to you. They didn't want to buy anything. And, like at the parts counter, it was, I know I need the bearing and the race and the seal, but just give me a piece of wire and a nail and some duct tape. And,
right.
And I didn't blame them. I mean, they were cutting corners. And I listened to my dad because, I was a young guy and I was caught up in the, this thing is growing and, we need to build a new building and we need to, he said, no, this stuff's all going to come to a stop. And when it hits the wall, there's going to be a mess. And I'm glad I'd listened to him because I'd have been out of business like a lot of implement dealers and a lot of farmers.
Yeah. And
that was a sad time. I mean, I know of a customer that never missed a payment. But they took the farm. They said, you're overextended. Your land values have dropped in half. Your equipment values have dropped in half. And there's no way that you can make this.
Yeah.
I mean, it was sad.
So, especially for you, I know I've talked to other dealers that to get through the 80s, it was parts and service. But then, dairy farmers always needed, miscellaneous equipment, the hay rake brakes, the baler brakes, etc. If you guys weren't selling short line stuff, was it with skid loaders?
Skid loaders, and then at the time we still had the construction contract. So
okay.
We were selling backhoes and that kind of stuff. But you're right. I mean, this is probably tales that other implement dealers don't want people to know, but the most profitable part of an implement dealership is the parts department.
Yeah, well, I'm sure.
The service department, if you worked on customer equipment, you would make money. But when you throw the warranty in there, you lose everything you made. You lose.
Right. Yeah.
But that was my dad's theory when we were growing was if you were on a tight deal, get it, because if you don't get that tractor sale, you're never going to sell an oil filter, a water pump, a hydraulic pump. You're never going to sell nothing for it.
Right.
And, he said these guys that hold out for 10% margins or whatever, he said 10% of nothing is nothing.
Right.
So he said, if you're on a tight deal, take it, because you're always going to have parts and service to back that up.
Right. Well, so it doesn't take forever, we better start skipping ahead to the 94 series, because that, to me, you start getting in a really fascinating time because of the farm crisis. They're introducing their new model, same as Deere and IH introduced their new models. Alice Chalmers introduced their new models right into the worst farm economy we had ever seen.
Right.
Well, it's at least since the 20s.
Right.
So the 94 series comes out. What did you think, and were they telling you got to take these tractors? Or
Yeah, the first group was the 18 and 2096. Them were the first ones that they introduced with the electronic shift and stuff.
And the Cummins. That was the
right. Yep. And that was the right size for here. But then the 94 series come out. They introduced them in Phoenix, and the electronic shift, they shifted so nice.
Yep.
The power shift case always had a reputation of being jumpy and jerky, and they were, because you were jumping 30% in speeds. And when, especially the 23s and 25s and 33s and 35s, they had the 6-speed power shift. So you got a speed in between each one, and they were really smooth. But yeah, no, Case kept pushing them to us. I had a yard full, and they just keep ordering. And we were kind of coming out of the farm crisis, it had kind of leveled off, and things were starting to turn around. So
there was a guy right down by me that had an 1896, but it was red, a red 1896 open station.
Okay.
It was a Maher.
Yep.
You sold that?
I sold that to him. Yep.
Okay.
He had a brother that farmed in Minnesota. I sold him some stuff too. But yeah, that Maher, it was right around the corner from Whiffs.
Right.
Yep.
And
yeah, we sold a lot of them. They came out in '83, so the first ones were red or white and black.
Yep.
Then in '85, they started painting them red. Same tractor, just painted them red.
Which I thought the white one was a 2096 in Case colors is a pretty tractor.
Yeah, I agree.
I always thought, because the 2096, the hood looks right on a 2096, and where the 94s and, they had that bigger bulge and everything. It just, the lines of that 2096 was a really sharp tractor.
Yeah, I agree. The color scheme and the decal scheme and the hood, like you say, without the bump in it like a 23 and 25 would have had, they were a good tractor. When we were, this is kind of skipping ahead a little bit, but when we were in Las Vegas and they introduced the Case IH thing, of course, the whole buzz was, are they going to be red or white?
Yep.
And they kept that secret pretty tight. And we were in Las Vegas, and they opened the curtains, and all the dealers were sitting in there. They opened the curtains, and all you could see was smoke with 2 headlights. And the music starts, and this tractor starts coming out of the smoke. And they teased everybody as long as they could. You could kind of make out the silhouette and the headlights and the smoke, and it kept coming forward and forward and forward. And pretty soon you could see it was red, and the roof about went off the place because it was red.
Yeah.
And I leaned over to my dad, and I said, oh, crap, they're red. And he said, who cares? He said, they've been white, they've been yellow, they've been gray, they've been orange. Who cares? He said, the international guys will like this.
Right, which he was right.
It was a good marketing.
Well, I read that the original plan was they were going to be white, and then the IH dealers basically said, you're going to lose us all.
Right.
If you...
That is true, because I talked to a couple of reps. Those tractors were actually shipped to Las Vegas white.
Yeah.
And they said they had, they come right from Houston, from Tenneco, to paint them red. And they went around finding body shops to paint them. And the guy was joking a little bit, but he said, we were afraid when you guys walked in there and put your hand on them, you're going to have red on your fingers.
Right.
He said it was that close.
Yep.
But it was a good decision.
Absolutely. I still think that that series of tractor looks better, white than the reds, but they were fine.
Right.
And well, in this time during this merger happened, we should say you had the case dealership in Menominee, but there was an IH dealer in Menominee that was he was a pretty strong IH dealer at one time for sure, right?
Absolutely. Ted Richards, I mean, great guy, super guy, good competitor. I mean, we traded stuff back and forth using forklifts and boom, I mean, great guy.
And then suddenly you both are like, there's probably only going to be one of us.
Right.
And I'm assuming you were both pretty nervous for a while.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I was a young guy, had 2 kids at the time. And, I was losing sleep over it. And I asked my dad, I said, you worried about this? And he said, no. He said, we're selling 20, 30 new tractors every year. And he said, they aren't. He said, you don't bet on a slow horse. You bet on a fast one. He said, we're getting a contract. I'm not worried about it. And it was a pretty straightforward deal. I mean, car pulls up one day and 3 guys walked in and they said, we need the family in the office. And I thought, oh boy, here comes the hatchet. So we went in and they said, you've been selected to be the dealer. We want you to be the dealer. If you don't want it, tell us right now because we're terminating the guys across the street. And I said, I got questions. How many tools do I got to buy? How much do I have to stock? How many parts do we have to buy? Do we have to build a bigger building? They said, you're fine. There's been a ton of research done. You're fine. We just need to know if you want it. So, I mean, it was over in, half an hour maybe? I mean, it wasn't a drawn-out affair. I mean, they just...
And at that time, did you know that there was a new tractor coming, or did you just assume it's going to be red cases?
Yeah, we just assumed it was going to be the red cases because we knew that they were closing the Rock Island plant because it had too much capacity. Wasn't anything against the people, the workers, it was just too much capacity. And actually, this is probably little known history, how the Case IH thing came together was IH approached Case and said, you can build this many, we can build this many, and it's too much capacity. How about we build your tractors or we rebrand some of ours, Case, change whatever you want changed. And Jerry Green said, how about we just buy you out? And that's how this whole Case IH thing come together. Then they said, well, yeah, that's a possibility. So they went to Tenneco and said, hey, we want to buy this. And, it'll solve a lot of the capacity problems. And so that's how that thing started was IH was going to build Case's tractor for them to, up their capacity. But I think it worked out. It's debatable depending who you're talking to, but I think it was the best thing for everybody. It gave IH the money to do R&D on the combines and planters, and here again it's a debatable point with a lot of people, but the Magnum, I had a friend of mine call me and said, hey, come on down here, I'm going to show you what's coming in 6 months. So I went to Racine and he took me out in the country and they had one there that they were doing photo shoots and stuff of, and he said, get in there and look at it, see what you think. And that was like 6 months before they introduced them.
Yep.
But it really, and I hate to step on IH guys' toes, but it really was a merger tractor. I can pick out stuff on there that's IH design and stuff that's Case design, but in my opinion, they built one hell of a tractor.
Well, in Case, that was the Cummins engine, but that was the CDC.
And that's a misconception with a lot of people. They just call it a Cummins.
Yeah.
But if you read the history of it, and I'm pretty sure I got my numbers right, I think it was like $340 million that Case and Tenneco put in the pot, so to speak, and Cummins put in the same amount, and they come up with this joint venture called Consolidated Diesel, and they were built in Rocky Mountain, North Carolina. Brand new facility. They gave the engineers a blank piece of paper and said, here, we need this version, and this version. Give it to us. So you had the small CDCs that are in like the skid steers and backhoes and the smaller tractors. And then you had the 5.9 that was in 18 and 20, and then like the late 1644 combines, 2144s, they had the 5.9, and then they had the 8.3, which was the Magnum.
Yeah.
And those engines are used in a ton of applications.
Oh gosh, yeah, that 5.9. I mean, we should say the 5.9 is probably most famous in Dodge trucks.
Right. Yeah, my brother's got a Dodge truck with a 5.9, and he's got 750,000 miles on it.
Yeah.
And the only thing he's ever replaced was the oil cooler, and he said, I think it was probably the gasket. I don't think it was actually the cooler.
Yeah.
But 750,000 miles and done nothing to it.
Yep.
They're just, they're like the Magnum. They're just bulletproof.
Yeah, good engines. And then they put that in the Magnum, and yeah, they took, there's design cues from all of them.
Right.
And then Case also got, I mean, the big appeal, which, 10 years earlier, if you'd have said, well, you get the IH Combine, nobody would have wanted the IH Combine.
Right.
If you were talking about a 915.
Right. Right.
IH had I think they were like 7th or 6th in market share in North America or something on combines. And the axial flow gave Deere a run for their money.
Right.
Like they propelled so far ahead with that axial flow. And
I kind of shied away at first of the combines because it was foreign to me. We hadn't ever sold combines other than back in the Case days.
The 660s. And,
yep.
Yeah.
And so I kind of shied away from it at first, but we had a territory rep. He was a barrel of laughs. And he was the one that kept getting me to order 94 series. He said, just keep ordering them, keep ordering them, keep ordering them. And he come in one day and set his briefcase down. He says, you're getting in the combine business whether you like it or not. And I liked the guy, and we talked about the combines at length, about how good the rotary was and what the parts demand was going to be. And so we actually, we really weren't known for combines like we were for Magnums, but Case IH was big on market share. Every month when a territory rep would come around, they'd have your market share numbers because everybody reported to the Farm Equipment Institute, so they knew exactly how many tractors were sold in your area and how many you sold.
Yep.
And we had 50% market share on Magnums, Steigers, and combines. It was, a lot of people didn't realize we sold as many combines as we did, but we sold a lot of them. They're a good combine, no doubt.
1660 was probably
that was our main seller.
Yeah.
88s or 80s were a little bit too big. I mean, if you didn't keep an actual flow full, they'd start spitting out the back.
Okay.
You had to keep them full.
Yep.
And the 1620 was actually no slouch. I mean, we sold some of them with 6-row heads, and they handled it just fine.
Well, didn't Mick have one?
Yeah.
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 And the early ones were an IH, weren't they a German diesel or something?
Yep.
And then later ones then 5.9.
Yep.
Was that non-turbo 5.9 then?
I think they were turboed, I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, maybe different pump or something.
Yep.
So back to the merger. What happened to Richard's inventory? Did you guys take some brand new IH stuff?
No, they didn't have much brand new.
Okay.
I don't think we transferred anything over from them. But whether it was Case or IH, part of that deal was if they took your contract, they took all the new equipment back and either transferred it to another dealer or, they also took all your parts back, and there was a lump sum payment. And if I remember right, it was $35,000. And I could be off a little bit on that. But that's how they handled whether you were Case or IH. They took the equipment back, took the parts back, manuals, whatever, and then gave you a lump sum.
Okay. I remember hearing, Don Roll told me that he said it was uncommon for if there was a case and an IH dealer in town, usually the IH dealer had more market share. It usually went to him.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking, there was like a little hotline that
Yep.
the case guys had and the IH guys had of what was going on. And I had a friend of mine in South Dakota that was the president of the dealer council for Case, the biggest four-wheel drive dealer in North America for Case. And I would have staked my life that he was going to get that contract. And he called me one day and he said, "Did you get it?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "How about you?" And he said, "No, they took ours."
Huh.
And I about fell over because I would have bet anything that they were going to get it.
Yep.
But they didn't. But yeah, no, you're right. Majority of where there was a conflict, they called it, it went to the IH dealer.
So we were talking about the 94s and 96s. Before the Magnum introduction, they were trying to wholesale these tractors out, basically.
Yeah.
And I heard they did the same with the 88 series IHs.
Yeah, they did, but it wasn't on the programming scale that the cases were.
Okay.
The IHs, they programmed them, but not like the 94 series. Because those IH guys wanted that last availability of a true IH tractor. So they did program them, but not like they did the 94s. They really hit them hard with programming.
If you would have had a diehard IH guy or a Richards customer come to you in 1986 and go, "I want a 5088," could you have transferred one?
I could have.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yep. They're all of that, whether it was a grain drill or a combine or a plow or a tractor, that was all fair game to us. I mean, we could transfer in whatever. I don't remember that we ever sold any 50 series. I mean, we could have.
Okay.
The one that I missed, and my dad was wrong on it, but we had the opportunity to get some of the 72 and 74 88s.
Oh, really?
They were programming really hard. And I thought about it, and my dad said, "No, don't do that." Because the ones around here had a pretty bad reputation. I mean, we got some warranty considerations for a couple of customers that had a lot of trouble with their 2+2s.
Okay.
And we got them fixed and got it through on warranty. But he said, I wouldn't do that. So I passed, and now them things are worth a fortune.
Oh, yeah.
Because they didn't make they only made like 15 of one and 18 of the other or something.
Right.
But
And there's not too far, Newman's, I think.
yeah, Newman's were a customer of ours.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, they programmed them hard. But the 50, 52, 54s, they did program them, but not real hard. And they disappeared fairly quick.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I think there were some of them around our area that got sold through Balls, because I think Balls always had like at least like that Bailey Nursery. I think at that time maybe they were running tractors through them,
Okay.
Because that's I had heard. I know O'Neill's down by us had one, and I think that came through like it was a lease return or something, a
Right.
5288.
Yeah, that rent lease got to be, we did a lot of it under the Case side, and then when the Magnums come out, and like Friday Canning International always had a canning company lease. I'd always heard about it, but never really knew what it was until the Case IH deal. And
Yep.
then they sent me a copy of this program, and I remember being at a meeting with a territory rep, and he had like, I think 6 or 8 tractors that he needed to move wholesale to a dealer.
Yep.
And he was literally begging. He said, "Come on, guys, I got to get rid of these, or I'll lose my job. I need to get rid of these." And a couple of the IH guys said, "Are they Holsteins?" And that's what they called the cases, were Holsteins, because they were black and white.
Yep.
And he said, "Yeah, they are." And I was sitting there thinking about it, and I said, "Have you got the invoices on them, Steve?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Let me look at them." So I looked at them, and they weren't anything weird. They were good, equipped tractors. And I said, you get new terms? Yeah. I said, I'll take them all. And he looked at me and he said, what? I said, I'll take them all if I get new terms. So we got them, sent them to Fridays on a canning lease. And then in the fall, they had a big program, and we were selling them things like right and left.
Huh.
Because they were old price.
Right.
And if, if somebody really wanted it red, we'd paint it red if you wanted it. And there was a misconception with that paint deal. A lot of people said that they took them back and repainted. They didn't take anything back and repaint them. That didn't happen. There was a lot of dealers that either repainted them or took them to a body shop. But as far as case, carting them back to Racine and repainting them and carting them back, they didn't do that.
So the story that I had always heard, so there was a 2096 that our neighbors bought, MFWD 2096, brand new, and I think they bought it brand new in 89. It was either 88 or 89, and it was white.
Right.
And they bought it at Hoyka's.
Okay.
And when they sold that tractor, I remember them saying that Hoyka's told them for $500, we'll paint it red.
Right.
And change the decals. And they said, why would we want our case tractor painted red? Is
right.
Why they didn't do it. But when they sold that tractor, they got big money out of it because it was like one of the last to be white,
right.
I think. And it was MFWD 2096. And I think it was 89. If not 89, it was fall of 88 when they bought it.
Okay.
I mean, were there still some new ones? There couldn't have been too many left.
No, that would be a rarity that because if it was white, it would have been 83 or 84 production.
Okay.
For it to sit around that long would be a little strange, but it happens.
Well, and the Magnum came out, the 2096, was there an overlap where they made them at the same time? Because they were a little smaller horsepower than a...
Yeah, they made the 18 and 2096 into the Magnum era for a while until the Maxims come out. Once the Maxims come out, that replaced the 18 and 2096.
And I think that might be one of them deals where they said Hoyka's got it, and it showed up white with leftover... Like they had leftover stuff or something when they built it, because I think it was pretty late. Like, because the 7110 is 7110 is physically the same size tractor as a 7140. It's just
physically,
yeah.
But it's got smaller axles and some less clutch plates and stuff, but physically they're the same size.
Where the 2096 was actually a smaller tractors. So that's what I thought. I thought the 18 and 2096 were built same time as, Yeah,
they, like I said, the 18 and 20s came out in 83, and then they overlapped into the Magnum era for a while until the Maxims come out.
Yep, which would have been what, 90-ish, 89, somewhere?
Yeah, 90, 91, somewhere in there.
Yeah. So then four-wheel drives, there were, at first they had the Case four-wheel drive and the Steiger, and then they eventually just went all to the Steiger.
They did build what was called a 9240 and a 9260, which were Steigers, but they were rigid frames. Yep. We sold a fair amount of 9240s here and a few 9260s, but I don't know, it just didn't seem to catch on with the old IH dealers. I mean, if you were like us who had sold a lot of Case, we sold them. And if you got out, you will see a lot of them like in Oregon and Washington, where what they farm is like this.
Yep.
They like that rigid frame out there.
Okay.
But other than that, you very seldom saw 9240s or 60s anywhere else in the country.
Yeah. Yeah, the unicorn, though, of the whole deal was that 9190.
Yeah.
There was less than 20 of those probably ever built.
Right.
And I remember that, and it must have been 86 or 85, they did that full line catalog of all the farm equipment, all the Case IH stuff. And I remember reading that a lot as a kid. And clipping those out. And that 9190 looks so odd because it's like, look at that old style cab and everything. And well, that's because none of the other cabs could hold up the weight of that tractor.
Right.
You know.
Right. Yeah, that was a big horse.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So yeah, you get into the Magnum comes out, and they caught on pretty quick, didn't they?
They did. You know, we demonstrated them all over, but when they first come out, you know, they had like a 1-year warranty, and John Deere was really running that into the ground. You know, that they're only 1-year warranty and they're not going to last. And you know, I used to keep a main bearing out of a Magnum and one out of a 4450.
Yep.
On my desk, and you could set the John Deere main bearing inside of the Magnum. But when Case come out with the 5-year, 5,000-hour warranty, that pretty well put to rest the reliability, because that was the big deal. They're not going to be reliable, you know. They're
Yep.
whatever, but that 5-year, 5,000-hour warranty really put that to rest.
And that was a good warranty from the standpoint of they transferred,
Right.
and then they backed it up because Don Roll bought I'm sure he shopped with you too, but Volds must have been pretty aggressive on a lease return 7120, and he bought that one from Volds. But I remember he used to get parts and service from you some too, but that one there, he turned that thing up to 275 horse or something, and it wrecked a few parts, and Case IH stood behind it at least the first time it shelled out.
To me, Case IH were really good with treating the customers right on warranty.
Yep.
You know, once Fiat got involved, it's a different ballgame. But we used to have a territory service rep that would come around, and he'd say, "What do we got this month?" You know, and if you had a really good customer that had even an out of warranty situation that you felt as a dealer this should have been covered, you know, he'd say, "Good customer, yep. Well, what do we need to do? Do we need to cover the whole thing, or I'll buy the parts? You guys split the labor." I mean, he would work with us, whatever we needed to do to keep the customer happy.
Yep.
You know, they were. I had no complaints with Case IH and the warranty. They would work with a customer, you know, whatever we needed to do to keep them happy.
So then you're selling the Magnums. Were you getting some 40, 50 series Deere trade-ins?
I'm trying to think of what we converted a lot of guys. We converted some white guys. We just south of here a mile. Those guys had been Alice Chalmers for as long as I can remember. Some of them traded. We had some guys that went from Deere to the Magnums. You know, the key to demonstrating those tractors was it used to drive Case IH crazy, but you would take it out and leave it with a customer for a couple, 3 days. Because if you went out in a few hours and got it, they would just say, "Take it," because nothing is where it's supposed to be. You know, I'm grabbing for the throttle and grabbing for the hydraulics, and nothing's where it should be. Yep. But after they've run it for 2 or 3 days, they get used to it, and they're comfortable with it. You know, that you couldn't go out and drop it off at a John Deere guy or an Alice guy and go back in 2-3 hours and say, "What do you think?" Because, yeah, take it. I don't like it.
Right.
But yeah, no, we converted some John Deere guys, Alice guys, white.
Yeah, because some of those guys probably, the Deere guys maybe a little bit tougher because they were used to a power shift. But you get an Alice guy or a white, you know, that one lever power shift is probably, you know, where the Deere guy was probably more used to it.
Right.
You know, but the trade-ins, if you got something like a 4440, 4450 on trade, this area, that's good property, right?
It is, but we tried not to resell anything in our area if it was John Deere International. And spills over from my dad's days. You know, you trade in a competitive, get it out of here. Go trade it to another competitive dealer for a case or an IH or a Magnum and get it in here. Because if you resell that 4450 or 4455 here, you're never going to sell a part for it.
Right.
Get it out of the area and bring a used 7120 or a 2594 or, you know, whatever. Trade it somewhere and get something of your own brand here so that you'll sell parts and service for it.
Did you have like some Deere dealers you'd work with and say, hey, I got this trade in?
Yeah, we had a couple of guys in South Dakota.
Okay.
I would call them and say, hey, I got a 4450 or 4640 or whatever. You got any case or international or Magnums? And, you know, we would haul out whatever.
Okay.
The other is there was a big auction yard in Illinois. We would take a lot of competitive stuff down there and sell it, and then
St. Anne's or something? Or?
Maury's.
Oh, yep, absolutely.
Yeah, those guys were very good to me. They treated you good. They were, I mean, if you pulled in there with a load of stuff before you got out of the truck, there was a guy on each side of the truck throwing chains off, and they'd unload you and reload you with whatever you bought. But yeah, we would, and they're big John Deere guys. They bleed pretty green, those boys, and so we would take, you know, and they had a lot bigger market. So if there was something that I was trying to trade in that was John Deere, and I was a little hesitant, I'd call them and say, you know, where's the market on these things? So.
Well, and then, yeah, your 55 series Deere, and that time you're probably getting some of the 8000 series Alice's and stuff like that. But you start getting into the 90s now, late 7100 series. That's when like Ford, I mean, some of the greatest tractors I think farming has ever saw is probably in that 90s era when, you know, like even Ford came out with that Genesis like
Right.
that. They were aggressively pushing those too.
Right.
Like O&R would have been your competitor there, right?
Right.
Because prior to that, there weren't a lot of Ford tractors.
We never, right here, we had a Ford dealer back in the 60s, but then he went out and really didn't have an aggressive Ford dealer. And you're right, the Genesis, when that came out, that was a pretty bulletproof tractor, simple, you know. I mean, they had the super steer and, you know, they were, I'm an old guy. I'm old school, but I think the best times were the 80s and 90s for tractors, whether it's Deere, Case IH, you know, Alice. That was the great times, I think, was the 80s and 90s.
Comfortable, you know, nice cabs.
Yep.
Reliable air conditioning. You know, like some of the early 70s air conditioning, it's like it
Right.
might work, it might
not, yeah, depending upon its feelings. Yeah.
Yep. And so they had all that stuff down, but yet mechanical tractors.
You didn't have all the electronic crap, I call it. You know,
Yep.
I'm just dead set against all this electronic stuff. And none of it you can fix yourself. You know,
Right.
you got to call somebody with a laptop to come out, and you know, I'm just old school.
Yeah. So then 90, was it 90 or 91, the 7150 gets introduced. Because it was later than the...
Right. The 10, 20, 30, and 40 came out as a group, and then
Yep.
it was later, you know, that horsepower push is always there, you know, more power, more power, more power.
Well, it was Deere, I think 7140 beat the 4850, but then Deere comes out with the 4955 to hit like 200 PTO horsepower.
Right.
So then Case IH comes out with the 7150 that goes
Right.
215.
And they, you know, that CDC, that 8.3 will put out a ton of power.
Yeah.
The guys down south found that they had a wastegate turbo on them. And the guys down south found out if you wired that wastegate shut, you get even more power.
Yep.
But then you start blowing the head bolts off,
Yep.
you know. But Yeah, I don't remember. We sold the first 7200 series in the state. We sold out our dealership. And I think it was the first, I don't remember, it was the first 7250 or 8950, but we sold the first one of them. But the 50 was pretty popular around here for chopping.
Well, I think, did you sell Kevin Lindstrom one?
Yeah.
So I remember Kevin getting that 7150, and it was like, wow, that's a big tractor. And he said at first, you must have had to do something to it, like something was up with the pump or something. He goes, it was kind of a pooch or something at first.
Okay.
And then,
yeah, I don't remember. Kevin, a great guy. I
Yeah.
mean, you're not going to find a better guy than Kevin Lindstrom.
yeah.
But yeah, he had that. I don't remember that, but it's possible there was something
Yeah, I think he said
poochy
just
about it.
something needed to be messed around with it. And then it
Right.
was good, but
Right.
but then he got into 7200 series, and so the 7200 series comes out and they make some improvements. I mean, they're not drastically different, pretty similar, but then the Mark 50s,
Right.
and you guys were selling a lot of to get a Mark. Not every dealer got a Mark 50
Right.
edition Magnum, right?
I can't remember the numbers behind it, but you had, for every so many, you got one.
Yeah.
Whether it was for every 100, you got one. Because we got two. I remember that. We had a 7220 two-wheel drive, and we had, I think, a 7250 front-wheel drive.
Okay.
So we had two of them. I got a picture of it someplace sitting in front of our building.
Do they? Do you remember where they went?
I don't remember where the 50 went. The 7220, we had an old guy. He's passed away now, but he lives south of Eau Claire. Didn't have any kids. He just liked to buy new tractors.
Yep.
And when he had a brand new 7220, he probably had 50 hours on it. And he come in one day and saw that Mark 50 there, and he says, I want one of them. And I said, you just got one. He said, I'll trade it in. I want that. I like the looks of that. he was quite a guy. I remember I sold him a Magnum one time, and I had one that I wanted to sell, and it had 20, 30 hours on it or something. And he said, no. He said, I want brand new. He said, I like the smell of them new ones. he was quite a character. But I know that's where the 7220 went, and the 8950, I can't remember. I don't know if La Rosa's south of New Richmond, they bought a ton of Magnums from us. They would trade like every year. They might have had one of them Mark 50s.
Did you tell that guy, well, you can have it, but it's got to wait a little? You wanted to sit there on the lot for a little while?
Yeah.
Or?
Yeah. We'd every spring we'd have an open house,
Yep.
so to speak, but it was an invitation deal. And we'd probably have 500 customers come to that open house.
Yep.
And, stuff that was sold over the winter we would hang on to for that open house, and then we put the customer's name in the window.
Yep.
And that Mark 50 we had sitting there with his name on it.
Okay.
But yeah, he didn't have a lot of acres. He'd probably put 150 hours a year, maybe.
Yep.
But yeah, those Mark 50s, I thought, that color scheme was kind of neat.
Yeah.
The way they did that.
Well, and then they did that 100,000th axial flow.
Right.
That 2366.
Yeah, that had some graphics on the side.
Yeah.
That,
and they only made one. Like it
Right.
wasn't a series, it was
Right.
just a one.
Right.
And that's just south of Ellsworth.
oh, is it?
So Faldy's bought it from Johnson Tractor down in Rochelle,
Okay.
and then they sold it to Pete Christensen. And that is the combine, and it's
Okay.
just south of Ellsworth. So it's still
kind of cool to have it in the neighborhood.
right,
Yeah.
right. So the 7200 series, you got the Mark 50s, and at that point, I can remember going to the dealership in the mid 90s, and you guys would have 20 plus Magnums on the lot, and then Steiger 4-wheel drives, there'd probably be a dozen.
Right.
I mean, the inventory that you guys had at a single store, back then is just unheard of today. Like
Right.
there'd be dealership groups today that don't have that many.
I keep reverting back to what my dad always, I mean, I picked up a lot of traits from him, and he always said you can't sell out of an empty bucket. You got to have inventory.
Right.
So anytime that they would come out with a deal on terms, I'd load up.
Okay.
So yeah, it wasn't uncommon to have 20, 30 Magnums sitting there.
And if you were like, if you had to order a tractor, like let's just say it's 1993, 1995, 1996, you're going to order a Magnum put on the lot, what were you going to pick?
If I had to order one and I could only order one, it'd probably be a 7220.
Okay.
But
Front wheel assist?
yeah.
And
the front wheel assist is I don't know. I'm sure people will disagree with me, but there's a lot of guys got them that don't need them.
Yep.
Two-wheel drive will do you very well, but you sell what the customer wants.
Yeah.
Everybody wanted front-wheel drive.
Yep. Yeah, that and the dual PTO.
Yep.
And they were, remember when 18442s were big tires,
Right.
And now they're, tiny.
When the MXs come out, we sold a fair amount of two-wheel drive in the MX, and then they discontinued them.
Yep.
You can only get them in front-wheel drive. And I asked the rep, I said, why'd you do that? I said, I need them. And he said, you're the only one in North America that's selling two-wheel drive Magnums. But we had guys out here they didn't need it.
Well, that's prairie.
Yeah.
You didn't need.
No. They turn good, but they discontinue them. There ain't nothing you can do about it.
Yeah. So to get to the MXs, so the 7200, the boxcar Magnum really put a run on Deere. As far as, Deere had been number one market share since 63, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
The Magnum was the first one to really give them a run. There were some green guys that switched to red, etc. And then Deere comes out with that 8000, and that was completely changed the tractor design with that 8000. What did you think of that? Because if you look at the MX, you don't have to put two and two together that's the tractor that they were trying to chase with the MX.
Right. I know everybody calls them boxcars, but I always refer to them as the good Magnum. And I was just so ingrained with that 71, 72, 89 series that when the MXs come out, I was pretty disappointed personally. But yeah, you're right. That when you look at the design of that MX, they were definitely chasing the 8000 series.
And what it seems like to me, they got, by the time that that second generation of Magnum come around, that 275, 305, whatever, they had started to get them pretty figured out. But the early MXs had some growing pains.
Yeah, the 40s and 70s, we had injection problems. You had to replace a lot of injection pumps and oil pans that leaked, and they come out with a stiffener that you would put in the pan. But the only way to get that pan off is pull the motor out to put that stiffener on the pan. And they had some wrong switches, I think, in the power shift. So we had some with relatively low hours that had clutch packs burned out of them. And you never heard of that with the old Magnums. You just didn't.
It was almost like they kind of rushed.
Just what I was going to say. I think it was in the R&D that they rushed that to market, to keep up with the 8000 series, where I think they spent a lot of time with the good Magnums, research and development, making sure they had all, because it was, the whole reputation of the company was riding on that Magnum when it was introduced.
Yes.
And they had to make sure it was right.
And they had an inventory of tractors that they needed to clear out. They had a merger to handle, so they had time to get that tractor right. And IH had been working on the power shift design for quite a while.
Right.
Well, then Deere comes out with that 8000 series, and Deere caught everybody off guard with that because Deere had that Gen 2 tractor since introduced in 72.
Right.
And a 4960 is actually just a continuation of the 4010, where that 8000 was a clean sheet.
Right.
And they kept that under wraps. Like no one really knew what was going on with that tractor, and then it came out. And if you look, within 4 years, the MX is out from them introducing it.
If you John Deere is great at keeping that stuff under wraps. I mean, if you read the history on the 4010,
Yeah.
at the length that they went to keep that under wraps, and the next generation, the 4030, 4430, they kept that pretty tightly to themselves.
Yeah.
And then the 8000s, nobody knew that was. I mean, they knew it was coming, but nobody had a clue what it was.
Yeah, and I always said, being around dairy farming, take a 4450 over a 4650 any day, because you wanted that smaller frame and, the ability to do it all. But after that 8000 came out, like, I never saw a point then really in the 7000 series, because it's like, well, that 8000 series had the visibility and the turning
Right.
of a smaller tractor in a bigger frame. And
When they went from like the 49s, to the 8000s, I mean, the visibility was so much better.
yeah,
It was like you weren't even sitting in a cab.
right.
I mean,
And then the MX comes out. And I remember seeing the MX the Wisconsin Farm Progress Show, because that was at Farm Technology Days by that point.
right.
I can't remember, but that was held here, just south of here a few miles, right? In
Right.
Rusk.
Yep. On the Finetti
Yep,
farm.
yep.
Yep.
And that's where, did they introduce the MX completely at that, or did they?
Nah, they had did it prior to that, but these were some like pilot production tractors that we had here, because I know when the trucks came in, we put them in our shop to keep them from the public until
Yep.
we run them over the morning of the show.
Okay,
But they had come right from, I think they had come from Clay County Fair. I think they had like 4 of them that they were trying to catch as many farm shows as they could.
okay.
But I know the territory rep wanted them kept inside till we run them over that morning.
Okay.
But yeah, it was kind of weird because they had 8900s on the display lot and the MXs.
Right.
It was just kind of weird. But
What did you think of the 89 series? Because there's the story that I always was told is Deere came out with the 8000, and that's why the 7200s went to the 8900s, was their number sounded too small. They wanted to have
they wanted to have some change, and when the 8000s come out, their turning radius was really good.
yeah.
And so that's in the 89s, they sculptured the front end different and changed the weight frame. They moved it forward so that we could get better turning, but it still wasn't as good as the 8000s. But it was,
Yep.
the 89s were quite a bit better than the 72s.
Did you like the 8900 series Magnum as much
Yeah.
as the others?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Did you sell a lot? Because they weren't built as long, were they?
No, there was a fairly short time span in there. I can't remember exactly what year the 89s come out, but it was kind of a stopgap kind of a deal. We got to have something,
Yeah.
and so they introduced them, and they were the same thing. There really wasn't that much change to them. It was more of that sculpting to get that turning radius more than anything.
Yeah.
But now we sold a lot of 89s. Just guys traded their 7200s in, but
Did you have some guys that just were on a rotation that
Yeah.
you were just going to order a new tractor for them?
yeah, we had guys that I knew would trade every year. Like the guy that we had the pictures of, he traded every year. La Rosa's traded every year. We had a bunch of guys that would trade every year.
Okay.
And we shipped a fair amount of used Magnums to Australia.
Really?
Yeah, we were down there on a trip, and then my wife and I went back, and we started stopping at dealerships because I didn't care about the bigger cities. I wanted to get out in the farm country, and So we started stopping at dealers, and I said, "How come you guys don't have any used tractors?" I said, "The Australians don't trade like you guys. They buy a tractor and they run it until it won't go anymore, and then they'll go get one." And we ran into a farmer that I think he said he farmed like 3,000 hectares, and I don't know how that compares to acres, but he had a 1066, and he said, "That'll take me till I retire." I said, in the States, if you're anywhere close to 3,000 acres and they tell you to farm it with a 1066, they're going to throw rocks at you.
Right.
But he said, "That'll take me till I retire." And so these Australians said, "We'd love to have some used tractors. Huge market. We don't have any." And so I was handing out business cards every place we stopped. And one day a guy called me and he said, "Hey, you really got used tractors?" Yeah. So he came up and I think we sold him 6 the first time. And it was kind of an interesting deal because he bought these 6 and he said, "Send them to," I think it was Baltimore.
Yep, the Port of Baltimore.
Yeah. I said, "Do you own a Globe?" He said, "Yeah, why?" I said, "Why would you send them to Baltimore to go to Australia?" And he said, "Because Baltimore, Savannah, and Jacksonville, the ships open up and they drive them in." He said, "If we take them to Tacoma or LA, they have to be lifted in." And he said, "It's a lot more money." And so he said, "Narrow them up as tight as you can because I'm paying square footage in the boat."
Yep.
So we took the front weights off and mounted them on the side of the frame and sucked the wheels in as tight as we could and turned the duals around so they were tight.
Yep.
Folded the 3-point arms up, did everything we could. And he said, "When you get ready," he said, "you call me. I'm going to fly back up there and I'm going to look at them because when they hit quarantine, if they find dirt, they'll ship them right back." So we cleaned them as best as we could. You know, the dirt between the suitcase weights.
Yep.
You know, we got that all cleaned out. And he flew up here, picked up a battery, and he goes, "Got to do better there," because there was some dirt under the batteries. And then we took the top of the cab off, and there was some dirt up there. And he said, if them quarantine guys find anything, they'll put them right back on the boat and send them back.
Huh.
At that time, he was paying $7,000 or $8,000 in sea freight to get them there.
Really?
But he, yeah, I don't know. We must have sold. We probably shipped 20 of them down there.
Huh.
But yeah, it was kind of an interesting deal.
Well, and I bet you had, with the dairy farmers around, as guys starting to buy 89 series or MXs, those 7100 series trade-ins were gold.
Oh, I mean, even today, if you've got a good Magnum, it will outsell the MX hands down.
Yeah.
When we were in the trucking business, we had a customer in Arizona that we hauled 46 of the old Magnums to him. And he always told me, he was a nice guy, huge dairy farmer. And he would say, "You find me a 7100, a 7200, 8900, low-houred and nice, you call me." He said, "I don't care if it's two-wheel drive or front-wheel drive, a 10, a 20, a 30, a 40, or a 50, you call me." And like I said, we hauled 46 of them down there.
Huh.
And I asked the kid one day when I was one of the first loads I took, there was Magnums everywhere. I said, "How many of these things have you guys got?" He said, "I'm not for sure how many total, but he said we use 30 on a daily basis." And so last one I hauled down there was an 8940 front wheel drive, had 1,025 actual hours. You could have ate off the floor. I mean, it was immaculate. And I got it down there. He told one of his boys he's back in the shed. The last 2 or 3 I hauled down there, he said they're hard to find. He said, "I'm just keeping them." So you just back them in the shed until one of the other ones. But he puts a ton of hours on them.
Huh.
I mean, they cut alfalfa down there every 28 days round the calendar.
Wow. Is that like down by like Buckeye or something?
Yeah, he's kind of by Casa Grande.
Okay.
You know, we had a versatile dealer down there that I hauled a lot of equipment to. He was super good customer, but it was all, you know, through our trucking company that we'd haul stuff to him.
Okay. So the MXs are coming out. They have some growing pains. Some of them were. Remember, Kevin told me he had. So the second generation would have been like the 210,
220.
230, 255, right?
Yep.
Because Kevin had a 240, I think, that he got from you, and then he traded for like a 255 or something.
Yeah, sounds right.
And he said that 255 was a pooch compared to the 240.
You know, some of the stuff we did didn't really fit the company structure probably, but we had another customer that had an MX 270 that was a pooch. And we had guys up here from Racine and our service rep, and we kept trying to get it figured out, and finally the territory guy said that's it's just you're gonna have to live with it. And one of my mechanics got me off to the side and he said, I can fix this, but he said these guys need to be gone. I said, all right. So we sent them guys back, and then it's funny how you can do this. I said, how are you going to fix it? He said, I'll do it with a computer. So he hooks his computer up, and it had all kinds of power. I said, what'd you do with it? He said, I just told it was a 2388, same motor, but the computer versions were different.
Yep.
So it just changed the configuration, and the guy was happy with the tractor, and it's just. But like I said, I'm not a computer guy. I don't like all that stuff.
Well, yeah, I think Kevin said that 255 or something was a kind of a pooch, and then he ended up, I think he traded him into like an STX 275 or something.
Yep.
And so it almost seems like that second generation of MXs came out, that they had kind of done some damage to their reputation.
They did. Like I said, with the trucking company, I did a lot of hauling in and out of California. And when I first started out there, you could run up and down the San Joaquin Valley, and it was full of Magnums. Every place you looked, there was the old Magnums. And you would see them disappearing. And you'd drive by a farm, and they'd have 2 or 3 8920s, and then they'd have John Deeres.
Yep.
Everything newer. And I talked to a dealership out there. I picked up something, and I talked to one of the mechanics, and he said, at our peak, under the old Magnums, he said, we had 35 guys working here in the shop. He said, now we're down to 6. He said, the MXs gave people such a sour taste in their mouth that they just wouldn't give them another chance. They went from the old Magnums to the MXs, and then when they come out with the second version of the MXs,
yep,
they probably corrected a lot of the problems, but it was too much damage had been done. A lot of the customers said, nah, I don't want nothing to do with it.
Well, and in typical fashion of like with IH, they fixed the 560, but Deere came out with the 4010 in the meantime.
Right.
And it's like, it's kind of too late at that point in a way, and
Yeah, IH, the 560 kind of killed them, they had problems, they rectified it, but the 4010 had put such a run on them by then that they weren't going to catch up.
Yep. I always said that was the beginning of the end, started back then, because that's when Deere got ahead, and then it was catch up after that. It was.
If you ever get the chance to find it or read it, there's a book called Corporate Tragedy.
Oh, yeah, I've read it. Oh, yeah.
And people, everybody thinks it was the strike that killed them in the farm crisis. There were the final nails in the coffin, but that thing had been coming.
Oh, yeah.
For a while.
Yep. Yeah, they went from being an innovator in farm equipment to milking the farm equipment division to finance everything else.
Right.
And
my father-in-law worked for Harvester, and he was die-hard IH man. he worked in the truck division.
Yep.
And he was a diehard IH guy, and him and I would banter about case and harvester, and he thought the sun rose and set on it, but yeah, that whole deal had been coming for a while.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
It would be interesting to go back in time and see where John Deere would be today had they not introduced the 4010. The 4010 and 4020 put John Deere on top of the world, I mean.
And they were innovating. I mean, people complain about that Soundguard cab, but when you look at what everything else had at the time, there was nothing like it. It was the first, body, actual, because even like a 1070 is a decent cab, but you could pull the cab off a 1070 and drive it around.
Right.
4430, you pull the cab off, you have nothing.
Right. It was that generation cab was the first pod style cab.
Yep.
Where it was all self-contained.
Yep.
And that, like you say, the 1070 was a great cab in its day, but you still got that engine heat coming back.
Yep.
And you got dust coming in everywhere. I mean, it was probably the best cab at the time. But once Deere come out with that pod style where everything was sealed up tight,
Yeah, the 4430 was not a perfect tractor, but a lot was forgiven because of that cab.
Right.
Yeah,
Case didn't get a pod cab till the 90 series come out.
Right.
That was the first one that was sealed up good and tight.
And at that point, Deere had put it gotten ahead of everybody that,
we talked about it earlier. It's too bad that a lot of the IH guys didn't push that Magnum even harder. I mean, if there was a little sliver of time that we could have put John Deere in the back seat with the Magnum when it came out. If everybody would have pulled hard, we might have been able to get ahead of them. And that was, I remember Jerry Green and them guys when they introduced the Magnum. It's a horse race. Red one, green one. And we're going to win this race. And if everybody would have really got on that and pushed hard, we had a little sliver of time that we could have done something. But they're uncatchable now. There ain't nobody catching them.
No. And that might actually, Deere should be careful because IH was that company.
Yeah, oh yeah.
At one time.
Yeah. Yep. You can't rest on your laurels.
No.
No. And there again, I go back to what my dad always used to, I'd come home, whining that I'd lost a deal, and he said, forget about it. No sense looking up a dead horse's ass. It's dead.
Yeah.
Go on down the road, get another deal. Forget about it. You're not getting that one back.
Yep.
And you rest on your laurels, that's what happens. You get, he always said, if you're not charging ahead, you're falling behind.
Yep.
And I've seen a lot of companies do that over time. They just kind of rest on their laurels, and some underdog comes running by you and leaves you in the dust.
Yeah. So 99, so 98, they introduced the MX, but you're still selling 89s. 99 then, there's big change, right? That's when Case IH decides to go public, right?
Right.
So Tenneco sold the stock, right?
It's Tenneco, when they bought Harvester, was the 16th largest corporation in North America. They had Newport News Shipbuilding, which built nuclear carriers and subs. They had Sun Giant Foods. They had packaging. They had Monroe Shocks. They had Walker Mufflers. They had insurance companies. They had Sun Giant Foods. They had all their pipelines all over. They kept selling companies off and pouring the money into Case IH. And Tenneco does not exist today. They're gone. They sold off everything and kept pouring it into Case IH. And then, you know, they set up Case as a standalone company and put it out on the market, you know, stock held company.
Yep.
And the stock did pretty well. But then Fiat bought up the stock, and
That was a little bit later though, right? Was that like
yeah, that would have been probably like 01,
okay.
somewhere in there.
I was thinking 01 or 02 or 03,
Yep.
but somewhere. Yeah. Because, yeah, they were a standalone company for a while. They went public.
Yep.
Well, then suddenly now you're back to the same thing as when you were a Case dealer and Richards was an IH dealer. There's a New Holland dealer right next to you. And
whether it's right or whether it's wrong, you know, I'm sure people are going to feel differently, but I thought the way Case IH went about it, you know, you're in, you're out, done.
Yep.
Was the way to do it. With the Ford New Holland thing, they operated them separately, and it was like survival of the fittest. You know, we're not going to take one out and leave one. You guys just battle it out between you. You know,
because that created some really hard feelings with Case IH started selling New Holland equipment as Case IH, and then New Holland started selling DMI New Holland equipment, and
there was some stuff that wasn't, what I want to say, fair. I didn't think with, because I bitched to the territory up. I said, you know, you're giving them our corn planter, but we're only getting pieces of the hay equipment. How come it's not across the board? They get everything, we get everything.
Yeah.
You know, at the time, Case IH had, you know, it's changed now, but, you know, like the chopper, we didn't get that at first.
Okay.
You know, and a lot of the stuff we didn't get, but they got everything. So, yeah, it caused some hard feelings. You know, I wasn't real happy about it.
Well, and then you're selling an MX up against a TG, and the TG is a cheaper tractor, right?
Right.
And then the New Holland dealer's probably saying, "Hey, it's the same tractor."
Right.
Right. Like,
yeah, they'd tell guys, you know, go to Racine and watch. They'll spit out a red one, and there'll be a blue one right behind it. But, you know, they were different.
Yeah.
But they just come down the same production line.
And the TG was cheaper, right?
Yeah.
So, did that start to cut? Did some of the TGs cut into the?
No, we really didn't. I mean, it was there, but we really didn't lose a lot of Magnum business to the TGs. I mean, you know, O&R was pretty conservative. I mean, good dealer, don't get me wrong, but he was just more conservative than I was. You know, I'd take chances, and I don't know. I just, you know, I got a bad taste with the MX to start with, and then the whole Ford New Holland thing. Yeah, I wasn't real happy about that either. But then, like we had talked, you know, Fiat wants you to buy up everybody around, and they came in my office, sat in my conference room, and said, you know, you need to buy all these other places. And I said, I ain't buying any. And they said, well, the future of this thing is we're only going to have 5 dealers in the state of Wisconsin. And this equipment is going to be put together in such a way that the farmer is going to have to come to the dealer to get it fixed. There's no more repair shops. There's no more fixing it yourself. You're going to have to go to the dealer because it's going to be all electronic, and we're not selling that software to nobody. And I said, well, I don't think, you know, good luck with that plan. I don't think it's going to work very well. And that, you know, that was kind of the beginning of the end for me, because I just didn't agree with that whole business model of forcing people, you know, to come to the implement dealer to get everything done. I mean, there's a lot of things that farmers can do themselves.
Right.
But if you don't have the software, you're out of luck.
Well, and at that time, Value had bought Volds at that time, right?
Correct.
So Volds was now Value. Roger Link Implement was still independent.
Yep.
but I'm assuming they wanted that to all be one dealership group. Was Swoboda's or whatever and Bloomer, were they still?
Yeah, he was. You had Value that had Osseo, and then they bought Eccles in Arcadia,
Okay.
and then they bought Triangle in Baldwin. And there's some other politics around that of what happened when well, I guess I could, because Doc Healy is gone and Paul Vold is gone. They both passed away.
Yep.
But Doc Healy was in our conference room and wanted to buy us out, and I can be pretty bullheaded, and I said no, it's not for sale. And we talked back and forth, and he said, well, I'm going to own all of the Case IH and Ford New Holland dealerships in northwest Wisconsin, and the farmers are going to learn how to pay. And my dad was sitting there, and he said, good luck with that plan. He said, farmers are pretty independent, and he said they'll drive 100 miles just to show you they don't have to do business with you. So, it went from bad to worse. And but Swoboda, he was there after us. Value ended up buying him.
Okay.
Roger just, I don't know, he was there after us too. And he just finally said, see ya, I'm done. But, a lot of the guys, M.L. Anderson at Barron, super good guy, good dealer, but small.
Yep.
And they just swept all them guys away. Just, But I should have saw it coming because, back in the 70s, the Case came to my dad and said, build a shop because we're going to close a bunch of dealers. And there was a dealer in Roberts. There was one in Hastings.
Yep.
There was one in Ellsworth. There was one in Durand. There was one in Wabasha. There was one in Bloomer. They closed them all. So, that was kind of the forerunner of farm consolidation, so to speak.
Yeah.
Farmers started getting bigger, which there's nothing you can do about it, but I think we're all better off if you had 50, 60 cow dairy guys. This big corporate thing I'm just not a fan of at all.
No. That's just it. When you think about all those businesses, all those dealerships that were supported by small farms, that was better. It was better for the ground. I think the ground was better off with.
Well, from an implement dealer, this is just kind of simple to it. But in the spring and in the early summer, before you couldn't get into corn anymore, we would rent tractors for anhydrous.
Yep.
Senex and Menominee had them. Senex and Colfax had them. FS and Eau Claire had them. FS and Cleghorn had them. We had tractors, Elmina. All these co-ops, now they're all condensed into one.
Yeah.
So there was all those places where we used to rent tractors, they all disappeared.
Yeah. It's not good as far as I'm concerned.
No.
So when did you officially quit selling Case IH?
2005.
Okay.
Was the end of the Case IH. That's when the contract disappeared, and we stayed for a year or two kind of as an independent. But
were you selling some short line stuff?
Not really. We over the years we had Sunflower, we had Bicon. We were pretty, and part of the problem was I drank the Kool-Aid too much. I stayed loyal to Case IH. I had the chance to take on McCormick. I had the chance for Versatile. I had the chance for Kinsey. I had the chance for Kloss Choppers, and I passed on all of them to concentrate on Case IH.
Yeah.
But, to be honest, if I had known in 2000 what I know now, I would have exited right there. I'd have been done. But we hung in as, I still got a couple of customers that kind of do business with me. They'll call and say, hey, I need a skid steer, I need a tractor, I need this, I need that, and I'll find them one.
Mm-hmm.
But now, for the most part, 2005, we were done. That was, right at the 50-year mark, because like I said, my dad started in 56.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that Menominee grew around your shop there.
Yeah.
Like that was out. You were out. You were out in the farm fields when you first built that.
If you're familiar with Menominee, when you get just past the last quick trip that they built on Richards' old place,
Okay.
right there was the end of Menominee. From there out was all farm country.
Yeah.
And I remember my dad and I sat and figured up from the edge of town to the interstate, there was like 18 herds of cows when he started.
Yep.
On 12, right, that bordered Highway 12. And he said, they all didn't have a full line of machinery, but they all had a tractor, a manure spreader, plow, planter. And they probably went together with a neighbor on a baler or a chopper, and they used them back and forth.
Yep.
But you had 18 places to sell equipment. Today, there's not a single herd of cows on 12.
No.
The whole way. And it's all farmed by 2, maybe 3 guys.
Yeah.
So, like I said, we'd be better off if there were 18 dairymen along that highway.
So when I sat down with Sig Weiss a couple of years ago, before he died, and he told me, which when it come to corn planters in the 70s, that John Deere 7000 set the standard of corn planters.
Right.
He said when they got the 7,000 in, like, I suppose it was in about 3 years by that point. Now, farmers are like, I need one of those. I thought he said they ordered 50 or 70 for stock.
Right.
Once, just out of Durand.
Right.
Like, that wasn't all of the current Tractor Central locations. It was one store.
Right.
And it's like today, some of those stores maybe don't sell a new corn planter a year now.
Right.
The 124-row high speed and
this is kind of off the subject, but on it. My birthday is April 29th of 57. And when my dad was still alive, we were out in a new building. And I pulled in, and it was my birthday, and I said, you remember what you were doing? I don't remember. 55 years ago or whatever it was. I mean, he said, yep. I was starting out a 2-row corn planter at Jack Cook's place. And I said, jump in the truck. So we jumped in and we drove down to Ronnie Prochno's. And I pulled in there, and Ronnie had a new planter sitting there, all spread out, And my dad looks at me and says, holy shit, how many rows is that? And I said, 36. So I said, in that time span, you went from 2-row planters to 36.
yeah.
I said, would you have ever imagined that? And he said, no. He said, I knew it would grow, but he said, I would never have fathomed 36-row planter.
Right.
Just.
Well, and when you think about that, so we've consolidated this much in a short time. In 20 years, what's it look like? Like, you wouldn't probably want to be in the machinery business.
I wouldn't want to be in the machinery business now.
Right.
With the technology. And like I keep saying, I'm old school. I had a customer, he was a good friend, good customer, and we would argue all the time about this GPS stuff. I said, you don't need that crap. He said, I get straighter rows. I said, so? It doesn't put any more kernels on the cob. It doesn't put 2 cobs on the stock. So what? You got a straighter row? And my dad would be sitting there. He'd say, you get more stocks in a crooked row. But I mean, he was just bound determined that, to me, you got to have a return on your investment. And if you're going to spend a whole ton of money on all this stuff, and, I just talked to a guy the other day. He used to be a mechanic, and he was helping some guy plant. And he said the planter started acting up. And he said then his phone started blowing up because all the customers were calling him, you know, our planner ain't working, our planner ain't working, our planner ain't working. Come to find out it was some satellite snafu that shut down everybody's planners. And I said, you know what? The guy across the road with the 4020 and the 7000,
Yeah.
he's still planting.
Yeah.
He planted all day.
Yep. Yeah, I don't know that it's always wise for us to try and engineer our own obsolescence.
Right.
You know, that seems to be a bad idea, but
Right.
yeah, I think you should bring back the Magnum shirts, reproduce them, and sell them. I'm sure you could market them today.
Yeah, it was funny. I would go to like Tacoma to the tractor pull,
Yeah.
and I'd see our shirts wandering around all over the place.
Yep.
You know, you would see the, you know, friends don't let friends drive green tractors, and the guy would turn around and then it's Lapine Implement, Menominee, Wisconsin.
Yeah. Yeah. I think you could probably bring them back because there's nothing trademarked.
Right.
It didn't say Case IH. It
Right.
didn't, you know.
Yeah, it was a lot of the shirt deal was kind of my wife's deal. I mean, she was handled that stuff, come up with them slogans and got the shirts printed and got the colors and
I miss that advertising sort of stuff, like with the manufacturers. Today, it's like they don't. We got 2PC, like back then they would flat out. I remember you guys would have them signs up there, like what showed the 9500 and then the axial flow on the other side of the fence.
Mm-hmm.
And the one side of the fence,
the turkeys.
yeah, they're starving, and the other
Right.
side they're all fat.
Yep.
And,
Yeah, you're right. We've gotten 2PC with all this stuff. You know, you used to, you know, and guys like Ronnie Prochnow. You know, I would try and sell Ronnie stuff. I think we sold him skid steers and a blower, but there was no way you're ever selling him a tractor.
yep.
But we would have good ribbing back and forth with
Yeah.
some of these John Deere guys. I mean, you didn't take it like people do now with the political correctness. I mean, you would banter back and forth and laugh about it, and you know, but
Oh, Deere was vicious in the 80s on the, like, going after IH about that one ad. I think I just put it up on Facebook here a week ago or something, and it was obviously like a 450, 4050, 4250.
the one with all the colors.
Yeah, and they're painting
yeah,
it.
yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
that was direct hit. That
Oh, yeah.
they were vicious
Yep.
about that stuff.
Yep.
And I kind of missed some of that, and you know, there was nothing wrong with having a little pride
Right.
in and it almost seems like, I think we're losing that with agriculture the way it's going. A lot of these farms, so you probably remember dealing with or talking to the dealers over the years. A Southern dealer, he was selling a tractor to a different customer than you were.
Yeah.
There was a lot of Southern farmers didn't drive that tractor.
Right.
It was hired help. They, you know, whatever. Where up here it was owner operator. You know, that tractor, a lot of pride in it.
I had had one of my customers that they took to Racine to look at the MX 150 and 170 before they introduced them. They took a handful of customers from all over the country down there. And I remember him coming home and telling me that there was a guy there, I think he was from either California or Arizona, and it's exactly what you said. You know, they were talking about operator comfort and this, that, and the other thing. And this guy says, I could care less. I sit in the office. He says, it's the hired people that drive them. I don't care.
Right.
You know, and this farmer, he just couldn't wrap his head around that because he was a 40, 50 cow guy. He bought one of the very first Magnums I sold. He bought the very first Maxim I sold. And that was his pride, was those tractors.
Right.
And he just couldn't believe this guy. I don't give a shit. He said, I sit in the office. It's the hired help runs them things. I could care less about the cab comfort or, you know, sun beating in it. And this guy, he just could not wrap his head around that can't believe the guy don't drive his own tractor.
Yeah. Did you ever get any customers down for like those Magnum showdown videos, like where they were doing the comparison to deer and the Magnums down in
Yeah.
Arizona?
We had them right here.
Okay.
Case come in with I think it was a 8950, I think, in like a 8400, and they had them weighted exactly the same, and they had a tent set up, and you'd bring them in and go through the everything about both tractors, and then you'd set them out in the field and let everybody drive them.
Yep.
But yeah, no, I've been to. They had the training in Phoenix.
Yep.
Yep. Where they had everything there. Case, IH, John Deere, Ford, everything.
Yep.
Yeah, there again, there's a lot of things that have changed in the business that I didn't like. I mean, we used to have what was called a trade fair. My parts manager and I, or my wife and I, you'd go to these things and you'd load up on parts, and all the vendors would be there, and you'd see new stuff. Like when they introduced the irrigation motors, I bought a whole pile of them, and we sold them all over out here on the prairie.
Yep.
And they don't do that anymore. Or they would have trips for dealers. We went to Australia, we went to London. My mom and dad went to Russia. They went on a cruise. I mean, we went all over. They'd come out and say, you got to sell 10 new tractors in the next 2 months.
Yep.
And you get this trip. But they don't do any of that stuff anymore. It was just a little extra drive to get you out there. And I tell people now, I mean, I drive by some of these dealerships at the end of October, and at 5:30 they're all closed up and gone. Well, when I was a dealer, the end of October was the end of the volume year, and it was like a holdback with dealers or car dealers. Everything that you had sold for the year, you got a percentage, and it was a graduated scale. So, maybe it was 2%, 5%, but we were always at the top of the scale. So anybody that was remotely interested in a tractor, I was like a dog with a bone. I wasn't letting go of it. So at the end of October, we knew exactly what time we had to head to Minneapolis. And, the end of October, I'd be driving the car. My wife was sitting there doing settlement sheets. My mom's in the back writing checks. And we'd have to get that stuff postmarked by midnight, October 31st, to get it on that volume year.
Yep.
And, we used to go to Eau Claire, but then we found out you could go to the cities and they'd postmark till midnight. And Eau Claire quit at like 8. So it was just, a couple more hours that you could be making deals. And, but nobody does that anymore. They're just, I've had customers call me and say, hey, when I used to deal with you, if I was remotely interested, you were out camping on my doorstep every morning. He said, I tell these guys now I want to buy something, and I got to call them 3 or 4 times, and nobody ever shows up.
Yeah.
It's just, times have changed, just.
And to younger people, like, they didn't see it like what it was like 30 years ago around here. Like, 50 cow dairy farm wasn't just there. It was thriving.
Right.
Like they were.
I graduated in 75, and most of the guys that were my age were dairy farmers.
Yeah.
And that's what they did. They went home and dairy farmed. But then as 3M come in and the glass plant come in, and the whole structure of the dairy guy, they couldn't compete with the big dairies anymore. They couldn't buy feed or supplies in the volume that them guys are buying in. They just couldn't compete. So they said, the hell with it. Went to work at 3M or the glass plant or wherever and just crop farmed.
Yeah.
Because they just literally got pushed out. But like I said, 70-80% of the guys I went to high school with were farm boys. I mean, that's what they wanted to do. That's what they did until they just couldn't compete anymore.
And even 20 years ago, there were still quite a few.
Yeah.
And it's like they just eliminated everybody.
Yeah, I would say, 05 is when we got out, and there was still we had a big customer base yet then. But that is, I look at my old customers, and man, they've disappeared, in the last 10 years probably.
Yeah. But I bet the difference was in 1994, that 50 cow guy was maybe buying either a new 7220 or he was buying a used 7120 or something like that. By 05, that 50 cow dairy guy probably wasn't buying new tractors anymore at that point.
They were buying the first series trade-in. You sold somebody an MX 200 and took in an 8920 with 1,000 hours or whatever.
Yeah.
That's what that dairy guy could afford, or even the third tier down,
Yeah.
But that new tractor was just out of reach.
Yeah.
It just didn't make sense.
I mean, because there were guys, well, like Mick bought new combines from you, and he wasn't a huge farmer.
Right.
And, I mean, because there were dairy guys that would have a new combine.
Right.
And that, you're not buying a new combine anymore without,
No, you're talking, I'm assuming a new combine today with heads probably pushing $1 million.
Depending on the size combine, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it's...
I was down talking to a customer, and he was having trouble with a sprayer, and he was talking about buying a new one, and he told me what a new self-propelled sprayer was. And I looked at it, and I said, I don't see it. I see a cab, a motor, a boom, 4 tires and drives. I said, it was like, I don't remember, it was like $600,000-$700,000. I said, I don't see it.
Yeah.
It just... But
it's crazy how far it just... It's almost like all this consolidation was happening, and instead of farmers going, now, wait a minute. They just went, well, I guess that's the way it is. We'll just get bigger.
Right.
And I just can't help but think it's not sustainable. But
I guess I'm wrong. I kept thinking that I saw a lot of similarities to the buildup of the 80s.
Yeah.
Machinery going crazy and land values going crazy. And, I told a young guy, I said, you're 2 ingredients from having one hell of a train wreck. I said, if interest rates go up and land values go down, you're going to have a mess on your hands.
Yeah.
And I asked an old auction guy, I said, you see the 80s coming again? He said, no, I don't. I said, why? I see so many similarities. Dealers building these big Taj Mahals, and it was the same going on in the late 70s. People buying land at crazy prices at the time and buying equipment. And he said, because there's so much outside money in farming today, that he said, I don't foresee that ever happening.
Yeah, I don't know. It's worrisome, but
it is.
And farming you need young people coming into agriculture, and there really isn't any entrance unless you're born into it on the production side.
Right.
You can go work for a farm,
right?
But then pretty soon all the farms up here will just be like that California farmer where he's like, well, I don't drive it.
Right.
And I don't think that's a good place.
No.
I don't think anybody's looked at California's model of agriculture as like if you were looking for a used tractor and you had to pick an area of the country you're going to go look for your tractor to buy, you're not going to California.
Are you aware of what, I think it's over now, but are you aware of what happened in California with the...
Oh yeah, when they were wrecking them. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, that was crazy.
Yeah.
I'd hauled a 2390 case to a guy. He paid $4,500 for it. He said, I'll put it in the program. He said, 2 years from now, they'll give me $75,000 for that tractor.
Yeah.
I thought, how can you do that? But they did it with combine. I think it's over now, but that was just crazy.
Yeah. What a,
It was a waste.
yeah, it really was. And then there was some really good equipment that got wrecked,
Oh yeah.
you know.
And there was collector stuff out there that you couldn't buy. There was a guy who had a 1206 International. I said, that for sale? And he said, it is. But he said, you can't afford it. I said, how do you know that? And he says, because I'll put it in the program and I'll get like 45 or 50,000 for it.
Right.
You know, and I had a guy had me look at a 4020 high crop. And I called him back and I said, the only thing you're buying is a serial number plate that says it's a high crop and the drop boxes and the drop front axles, because I said the hole in the transmission is that big and the one in the block is that big. I said, it's, you know, you're going to have to replace both housings. But that was a program tractor. They,
Yeah.
you know, just, yeah, I mean, that was weird how they did that.
Yeah, they didn't, I mean, tractors out there even before all that were not known to be nice.
No.
They'd be 12 years old, and I mean, their paint's cooked, and
If you want, I mean, the nicest stuff that I had hauled over the years being over the road was come out of Illinois.
yeah.
They're
Yep.
nice.
Yep.
And you know, believe it or not, I can tell you without seeing a sign when you cross from Illinois to Indiana that the buildings aren't as nice, the equipment's not as nice. Illinois is just, and Iowa to an extent is close. But, you know, you get Texas, everything has got that Texas fade to it.
Yep.
Montana, it's funny out there, those tractors have got a fair amount of hours, but the tin is really nice on them. But they all have the what do you call it, the blue sky machine shed.
Yeah.
They don't
Oh,
put
yeah.
anything inside. It sits outside.
Yep.
I would drive by places, the same tractors sit out along the house year after year after year.
Yep.
The tin is good on them, and it's not rusty, but it's got that fade to it from the sun.
Yep.
You know?
Same with them southern tractors, like, you know, Louisiana and that. I
Yeah.
mean, they just,
They've got, you know, you take Arkansas, Louisiana, you know, they've got a ton of hard hours.
Yep.
I mean, really hard hours. But you get close to the coast, and you would get it in California too if they got over along the 101, too much salt air.
Yep.
I mean, you could literally stick your finger through the tin work.
Yeah.
They were so rusty, it was. So yeah, you gotta, you know, there are some nice spots. Like I say, Illinois is where you find the nicest.
there's some nice stuff around here.
Yeah.
There were some dairy farmers that took a lot of pride in their stuff, but we've gotten to the point where you know, there's such little dairy around here now that most of the crop farming stuff, as long as, you know, they didn't drive it in the winter or nothing like that, which
Right.
that would kill a tractor around here as a manure spreader in the winter.
Right.
But, you know, with that, our sun doesn't get as hot up here. Guys always have machine sheds for the most part,
Right.
you know. But yeah, I think that's the kind of agriculture that we probably needed more of, not less
Right.
of, and then
Right.
we're getting away from that.
Yeah, you know, we get further and further away every year,
Yeah.
you know.
So if you had to pick of all your years of selling tractors, because what year did you actually start selling?
I actually started selling I graduated in 75, and I started pretty much full-time selling in 76.
So if you had to pick your favorite era of tractors throughout, what are you selling?
It's hard for me not to say the Magnum era, you know,
Yep.
the 7200 series. I mean, we were in our heyday, and I liked the tractor. It was good. The other one that I have a soft spot, and you and I would probably disagree, but the other one that I really have a soft spot for is 1175.
Okay.
They were like a Magnum. They were bulletproof.
Because the 1170 was a problem child, right?
Now, you hear that, but we sold a lot of them, and we never had any trouble with them. But the 75, I don't know why I didn't push those harder. The biggest drawback, I mean, it was good, but it was a drawback, was the planetary axles.
Yeah.
If you were going to change your wheel spacings, they were a pain in the ass.
Yep.
But they were, man, them things were.
Well, I pulled that one.
They were bulletproof.
I had that one that I pulled for years.
Oh, yeah?
Way back when. Yep.
Okay.
And, yeah, the straight shift.
Yep.
You could put a 1470 clutch in them.
Yep.
So they would take power.
When we were in business, we had a 970 that we pulled, and we had an 1170.
Yep.
And that 1170, we changed the turbo, we changed the pump, and that was it. We poured as much fuel as that pump would put out. Our dyno went to 360 horse, and it would bury the needle, and we still had a long ways to go to get to PTO speed. Because we would pull that with 20.842s. We had some rims made for it.
Yep.
We'd pull it in 20.842s in 16,000 pound class in fifth gear, and they only had 8.
Yep.
And we'd never run out of power, ever.
Yep.
They're a horse.
Yeah, and the 1175 and the 1090 were kind of cool tractors because they simple.
Yep.
And like a 1090 probably never had enough. If it didn't get turbo, it probably never had enough horsepower to hurt itself.
No.
Because they were way overbuilt.
Right. It was built for the rice country and down south.
Yeah.
And then 1090. But if, like I said, if I had to pick an era, the Magnums are pretty. Our youngest son, his name is Michael Magnum Lapine. So the Magnums they're that era, is pretty hard for me to beat. I mean, we were selling them things and having fun, like we were talking about the t-shirts and stuff, we were just having a good time doing it. The 94 series, I sold a ton of them, and I'm a case guy at heart, but the Magnum is still king of the hill, I think. You know, as far as me in my time around, The other one that's got a soft spot for me is a 930.
Okay.
And I'll argue all day long with people that think the 1030 is the best thing since sliced bread, but I'll take a 930, everything factory. I'll stay right beside you all day long with a 930, and I won't have cracked heads. I won't have cracked blocks. It'll start, but those are the two that are my favorites, are the 930 and the 1175. But as an era, that Magnum is pretty tough to beat.
Well, this was fun. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah,